This is Counselcast, part of the Legal Talk Network, and I'm your host, Karin Conroy. When you face a complex case outside your expertise, you bring in a co-counsel for next-level results. When you want to engage, expand, and elevate your firm, you bring in a marketing co-counsel. In this podcast, I bring in marketing experts who each answer one big question to help your firm achieve more. Here's today's guest.
I'm Rob Freund. I'm an advertising and e-commerce attorney. I started my own practice in 2019 after being with Greenberg Traurig for close to 7 years. I was a commercial litigator there. I did a lot of false advertising, class action defense work. And now what I do is I represent direct-to-consumer brands, marketing agencies, talent agencies, and individual creators and provide advice and counsel to try to avoid advertising litigation in the first place.
Oh, this is going to be good. So thank you for being here. This is such an area of mystery for not just the world in general, but also I find for a lot of the firms and attorneys that we work with, because it is changing. I feel like there's, things change all the time. And so that's one thing we're going to talk about, in addition to a lot of potential pitfalls. So the title for the show today is Social Media and the Law, Top Legal Blunders to Avoid. So first, I feel like you've got, I already looked at some of the stories you have on your blog and some of these experiences and with your clients, things that have come up and issues. And there's a lot there that I think people are not really paying attention to. So what's the first thing? What's the most common issue that you see when people are first contacting you?
There's a few that sort of generally start the process, an issue that someone will come to me with. Very common is brands or agencies using content that they found elsewhere online on their own pages. So if a brand sees an Instagram post, for example, a pretty common thing is a clothing brand. A creator posts a picture of themselves wearing the clothing. Maybe they even tag the brand. A lot of brands will assume, okay, well, I can use that content on the brand's page, either because they think, well, it's publicly available, so I can use it, or they tagged me, so I can use it. There's a lot of disputes around copyright issues with that and publicity rights. So more generally, just using content and repurposing it, or even commissioning content to use in your advertising, lack of clarity around the contracts or who gets to do what with that content is a big one.
Yeah. What about music? Because I noticed that you had some details there, and I feel like that is a real confusing area for a lot of people, because you see everybody using these same certain songs, and of course there's like trending music on different platforms. So where is the safe place when it comes to using music?
The safest thing to do, and the safest and easiest thing to do, is use music that you have the rights to use through a platform that you can be certain has cleared all of the rights to that content for you. For example, there's a really popular one called Epidemic Sound. They have a huge library of different sounds, and you can be sure that they have cleared all of the rights for all the possible ways that you could want to use that music, commercially, editorially, or otherwise. They've got the sync licenses, they've got the mechanical licenses, everything. So when they say royalty free, you can be sure that means I can use this however I want to, depending on which license you purchase.
And okay, so you have to purchase a license for that platform.
Yes.
Okay, and so once you purchase that license, you now have the rights to use that music, and that's a good, safe place to be.
Right, and they're not the only one that provides that,
Sure.
But that sort of service, you can be as safe as somebody could be in using it.
Okay.
So the issues come up when, especially on TikTok, there's different libraries that are available to you depending on what kind of account you have. If you have just sort of an individual account, you can use all sorts of popular tracks. If you have a commercial account, you're limited to TikTok's commercial library, which supposedly they have cleared all the rights for you to use in advertising. So sometimes brands will contract with influencers or creators to run ads on their behalf, and they assume that because the influencer has access to the broader library, well, I can use this trending song that's popular on the radio because the influencer is doing it. But we've had lawsuits against brands who have done that from big record labels. The brand is either contracted with influencers or posted on their own page using music from the broader library. And a couple courts have said you're liable for copyright infringement if you post it on your own page, and you're potentially vicariously liable for what your influencers do, because that's effectively your brand's advertising too.
Sure. Okay. So don't use the widely available stuff on TikTok. Make sure you're getting that license through one of the more reputable platforms, just to add an extra layer of safety there.
That's the safest place that I would recommend.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So what other issues do you see come up more frequently?
In terms of advertising, reviews are a common one right now. There's a lot of regulatory attention to fake reviews, manipulating how customer reviews and testimonials are used, suppressing negative reviews, incentivizing them.
Let's talk about that. Let's get into that, because that is something we talked about this for really briefly before we started recording. It's something I talk to people about probably on a weekly basis. So let's first talk about fake reviews, like buying reviews, and would that fall under the same category as buying likes and subscribers?
Generally, yeah, that's sort of the same issue. So the FTC has made it clear that buying and selling fake followers or fake signs of engagement is illegal. So
And what have you seen happen in terms of those kinds of issues? Have they come up with some of your clients?
So in my practice, what will typically happen is a client will say, we have these landing pages, these funnels, or this website. We want to know what the risks are, explain them to us, and then what I will say is, well, here are the issues, here's what the law says, here's how similarly situated businesses have run into problems, and then ultimately whether to take on a certain amount of risk is a business decision, and I'll try to work with the client to, if some sort of changes need to be made, make them so that they align with what the client's risk tolerance is, essentially.
Yeah. So they're asked, should we do it?
Yeah, or if we do this, what are the risks?
It seems like everybody else is doing it. Why shouldn't we? Yeah.
But we have seen FTC cases about it, at least one. And the reviews issues pop up in false advertising class actions. I haven't seen one yet that is solely about review manipulation, but it has been a claim that's asserted as part of a broader false advertising claim in a variety of consumer class actions.
So where does that lead? I mean, they're basically building this whole case for they contracted maybe an agency or someone to do a bunch of advertising for them, and then they came back and did a bunch of fake reviews, or it's part of a larger case in terms of what other kinds of elements?
So it depends on who's doing the suing. For these consumer cases, it can be something like, well, I wouldn't have bought this dress if I knew that all of the testimonials on your website are fake.
Yeah.
Or I didn't know that they're all paid for.
Yeah.
Or I didn't know that there were actually 20,000 one-star reviews because you only show the 5-star ones, something like that. And so, the damages theories can vary. From the regulator's perspective, like the FTC, the concern is basically the same. You're doing harm to the marketplace, you're deceiving consumers, because that you're basically omitting information that would be material in someone's purchasing decision, and it's unfair and causes consumer harm. That's basically the idea.
Okay, so this seems like a silly question, but I feel like it still needs to be said. So if you're a law firm and you're looking and you're thinking, oh gosh, maybe I'm brand new and I don't have much of an online presence, and everybody's talking about how important these reviews are, and you're thinking, maybe I should just go out to somewhere, I'm not even going to mention the places that I know of where you can do this, and just quickly get someone in Bangladesh to get me a few hundred reviews. Among a million other reasons why, you've already mentioned it's illegal if the FTC kind of figures out that it's fake, but why is this such a bad idea?
Setting aside the ethics issues, because I can't claim to be an expert on that, but you can bet that your state bar would not look favorably upon just fabricating social proof. But if it's a completely wholesale fake review, it's just plain false advertising and arguably would support a fraud claim. The FTC's general stance is that all advertising has to be truthful, not misleading, and substantiated. So all endorsements have to be from someone who has actually used whatever the product or service is that they're endorsing. And it needs to reflect their honest opinion or belief, even if they've been incentivized.
Yeah.
So if you just buy a completely fake review from someone who's never experienced your product or service, then you're essentially checking all the boxes of things that are wrong with that. So.
Okay, so let's move on to negative reviews. So this is something I also talk about all the time that really frightens a lot of lawyers and law firms in terms of being present on any kind of platform. Yelp being a main one that people are more concerned for some reason about Yelp and their ability to leave negative things on Yelp. But I usually point out that, you can get a negative review anywhere. It could be on Instagram. It could be on Google. It could be anywhere. And anyone, you're a lawyer. There's always reason for someone to be upset with the way a certain thing turned out. So what do you typically say about negative reviews, what to do about them, and the potential risk for that to happen?
One thing that you should absolutely not do, and which I've seen physicians get in trouble for, is put a clause in your contract with your clients that prevents or attempts to punish them in the event that they leave a negative review.
My gosh.
The Consumer Review Fairness Act prohibits those sorts of gag clauses in consumer contracts. So if I understand why that would be appealing to want to just sort of silence that in a contract, but even presenting someone with that contract, even if they don't ultimately sign it, is a violation of the CRFA. So definitely don't do that.
Yeah.
But to your point, negative reviews are just a fact of doing business.
Exactly. Yeah.
Long enough, it's going to happen. And
right.
I mean, in some cases, it can appear more authentic than, wow, you have 200 5-star reviews? Like, how did this happen?
That seems fake. And I will say from a marketing perspective, I've read plenty of articles that talk about if you have a lot of reviews, let's say it's 200, and it's all 5-star reviews, people don't believe or trust that. And because they understand that that's not real life, that especially if you're a lawyer, like every time you settle a case, one person's going to be unhappy. Mm-hmm. And so there's a likelihood that unhappy person hopefully is on the opposing side, but there's a likelihood that they come to your, profile and leave you a review. So even on Amazon reviews, regardless of how great this product is, there's some person out there that just didn't like it or is having a bad day. And so it is more trustworthy on reviews psychologically for people to see that it's, 4.8 or 4.9. And then they can read those crazy reviews. And I do this a lot of times on hotels where I say, oh, okay, that is not, that person is cuckoo. And, that makes me believe even more in those positive reviews because this was the outlier.
Right. Yeah, same thing. I mean, I do that too. I'll look at restaurant reviews, and if there's a 1-star because somebody's Uber Eats was delayed,
right,
it's not going to affect whether
right.
I'm going to visit that restaurant.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think a lot of people get hung up on what to do about it and how to respond and in what sort of format. I think that this is just, this isn't like legal advice, but just my take on responding to negative reviews. Sometimes you will get people who are just mistaken. Like maybe your law firm sounds like a different one in a different part of the country and you get
right.
a review. And it seems effective to me when those firms respond and say, this person was never a client according to our records, and just leave it at that. Trying to argue with people in negative reviews just is never a good look. People are smart enough to understand what's going on generally.
Yeah.
And if they're not, maybe you don't want them as a client anyway. So
right.
I don't think there's a lot of upside to trying to debate people if it's something like that, or even if it's somebody who is disappointed, unless it's a situation where you achieved a certain result and they're just saying something that's not true. You can say, actually, we took care of your case and please contact us if there's anything else we can do.
Yeah.
It's like a professional response that shows that you understand and you're setting the record straight if it needs to be without being combative.
Yeah, the advice I usually say is be quick about it. don't let a negative review sit there for months, because then that just is a kind of reflection on your systems and what people can expect when they come into your office. Like, how many other things do you have sitting around on your desk that you haven't replied to in months? And so it's mainly just show them how responsive and quick and effective and professional you are without getting into the nitty gritty. And, like you were saying, if you just kind of want to open that conversation and ask them to contact you, that's one of the best things you can do. Like, let's just have this conversation offline. We know that you are unhappy with, the way things turned out, and, sorry about that, but let's talk about this somewhere else.
Yeah. That's good advice that I give to my clients in the business context too, because if you're racking up a lot of negative reviews as a business for a consistent issue on a place like Trustpilot or the BBB, that is if you do not respond to those negative reviews or those negative comments, then the odds that will draw the attention of a regulator are much more likely. Yeah. And in consumer class actions, we'll see very commonly in the complaint itself, for example, if it's a case about not being able to cancel a subscription, the plaintiffs will usually say, look at these 1,000 negative reviews on Trustpilot, and they'll screenshot them and put it in there. Yeah. So if you respond quickly and consistently in a way that attempts to resolve it, then that is a good safeguard against more risk of a regulatory action or something like that. Well,
and dovetailing on that, even though it can be difficult and a pain, the more positive reviews that you have to offset that's super important. So have a process for that. And the best time psychologically to ask people for a review is when you have a positive outcome. And even if it's not 100% exactly what they wanted, but they enjoyed working with you, or you were quick and whatever, like if they have anything positive to say, do it at the moment or as close to that moment as you can. So there's a reason that Trader Joe's gives out samples, is because you have got this sample, and there's a psychology that happens in kind of this gratitude, but also obligation. So as soon as you get that sample, you're like, thanks so much. And I'm kind of now thinking about buying this thing, more than I would have if you hadn't given me the sample. So think about that in terms of your work as well. Like, you've given them something great and, some kind of a result that they were hopefully wanting, but maybe not expecting. And then at that moment, that's when you ask them, kind of like in Trader Joe's, now you are asking them to buy this thing or give you the review.
That's exactly what I do. So anytime a client responds with, like, thanks, this is great, or I really enjoyed working with you, that's when I'll say something like, by the way, one of my goals this year is to get more Google reviews. If you feel so inclined, here's the link to do it, or something like that. And every person that with one exception, that I do that with at that time will leave a positive review. Sometimes they'll say, hey, good timing.
Right, exactly.
Because they'll understand what I'm doing, but people don't.
Exactly.
They don't see it as like salesy or anything.
No. So, it's just like, hey, like, you're saying this positive thing to me. Would you mind letting the rest of the world know too? Right. Yeah. It is really important with the timing. Okay. So moving on, let's talk about, let's see, what else, what other kinds of, I know we were talking about buying likes and reviews and fake reviews and all of that stuff, using music. What about having guests in some way? Let's say something like this, where you have a podcast or you have someone come onto your social media channel and they're a guest and they say something questionable, defamatory, problematic in some way. What is your responsibility for that?
If you're the host, you should think very carefully about whether you want to edit whatever that segment is out or not publish it. Because if you record it and there's a defamatory statement made, or something else that could subject the speaker to liability, you're both co-authoring that piece of content. So by publishing it, there's risk that you could be on the hook for a defamation type of claim as well. But even, without doing a sort of liability risk assessment, it's just good practice to make sure that your content is brand safe. Isn't the right way to put it in this context, but just use common sense about what you're putting out there.
Well,
And
in terms of like a law firm, sorry to jump in, but like another conversation we have all the time is how to talk about like testimonials, which are slightly different than a review because we're talking more specifically about like some sort of a case result. And sometimes there's privacy concerns there, depending on how the details of how that settlement worked out. But how can you safely talk about, like, this is work that we did, and we want to talk about our great results for this client without having those kinds of problematic issues where we don't want to say something negative about, like, for example, if it's just an employment lawyer and we don't want to talk negatively about this large company that they worked for that we got this settlement against.
Yeah, it's sort of a judgment call, but the issues to think about are, if you settled this case, what are the confidentiality terms of that settlement?
Yeah.
You certainly don't want to be in breach of that. You also want to be careful about disclosing particulars of a certain result. And this sort of goes back to general false advertising principles. If a business is in their advertising representing an earnings claim or a performance type claim, then you need to ensure that whatever that result is reflects the typical expected result of the typical person who's buying a similar product or a service. And if it isn't, then there's a certain form of disclosure that you need to make. It usually comes up in like the business coaching context, like this client
or like personal injury lawyers,
Sure.
where they're like $5 million for, whatever. And it's all dollar signs all over the front of their website.
Right. You should be sure that it's clear that, this is not a typical expected result, and then you should disclose what the typical expected results are. That's a general advertising principle. Again, I'm not totally sure how the states regulate those sorts of presentations in the legal context, but the same concept would apply regardless of the industry.
Yeah.
So the more that, especially if you're having someone on the show, like a client or something like that, or you have them film a testimonial, the more they can talk about the quality of your service and how good the experience was and how happy they were with the result, unless I got $1 million check in 30 days, the better. It's much safer to speak in terms of satisfaction than specific results.
Yeah. The other thing that we talk a lot about, and we won't get super into this, but I just also wanted to mention it, is your website terms. So your policies and terms on your website kind of tie in with this idea of having those disclaimers about, this is attorney advertising, case results do not reflect, blah, 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 all of that legal stuff, making sure that your terms on your website are up to date. And that stuff changes. We see it changing on a weekly basis from one state to the next. It's really tricky to keep on top of it. And this is not a sponsored episode in any way, but we use a service where it is constantly, we embed it into the site and it's constantly updating as the laws change. So we recommend something along those lines because it's really hard to keep up with it. But just another kind of tip to kind of slide in to make sure that you've got those. If you're not using a service like that, you got to stay on top of it. Make sure that your website and the terms on your website are updated, because the cookies stuff, the GDPR, like all of that stuff on your website can get messy. And we're seeing lots of lawsuits about that kind of stuff just because it's an easy way in. So again, just a little legal issue to try to avoid. Are there any like new things, keeping that in mind, that you've seen, new laws or things that are changing, like fresh type things that are popping up in terms of social media and the law and things that are changing, like as opposed to the last few years where people are getting stuck with things that they didn't see before?
My answer to that is the reviews issues that we talked about, that there's new rules coming out from the FTC that are going to become finalized. There's just much more attention to how you're using reviews and testimonials. So it's convenient that we talked about that, because that's also my main answer to this question. But also things like the use of artificial intelligence. There's ad agencies that are really pushing using AI to either create user-generated content or things like that. And there's just a whole host of issues to pay attention to. The point that I would make, that I usually tell clients or respond to people on social media, is there's a common misconception that because the technology is new, it's unregulated. So there's a lot of these agencies that are like, well, there's no AI law yet, so we can use, this model in this advertising, or nobody
Yeah.
really owns the rights to this content. It's a mistake to think that the same
Yeah.
advertising laws apply to new technology. It's just
Yeah.
we haven't yet had courts weigh in on every nuanced new issue.
Well, and at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily have to be a law specific to AI technology. If you
Right.
have AI write something and it's false and misleading, it doesn't matter who wrote it if you posted it on your blog post, on
Yeah.
your blog. So, I mean, one way or the other, and this is another topic that I've talked a lot recently about, but you really need to be careful with this AI stuff. We already have disclaimers in the content that we write to say that we do have AI tools that we use to optimize, check for SEO, make things better, but we do not use AI to write our content. We still use humans for that because it's not there yet.
Right.
And there's so many potential issues that you are kind of facing by doing that it's not worth going down that road at this point. All right. So before we get to the book review, anything else that you want to add in terms of laws, social media issues, potential things that you're seeing pop up? Any other words of advice?
I think we covered it pretty well. I think that it's important to think about the consumer or whoever your potential client is who's seeing your ads. I like to say that, and I'm borrowing this from another advertising attorney who's a friend of mine. He's in-house at a telecom company, but he said something to one of our other friends who had this sort of like clever, sort of sneaky idea for a web page to solicit donations. He was joking around, but semi-serious. And my friend said, listen, do you think you're being clever? If so, you might want to take a look at whether what you're doing is illegal. And that's like generally pretty good advice. Like if you think that this is going to work because people don't fully understand the truth of what you're doing, probably a good time to really think and have somebody review it if you're not comfortable reviewing it yourself.
Right. And clever, like I'm using air quotes, clever is another word for sneaky. And sneaky pretty quickly, like you're down the road of, am I doing something legal? And if you have to ask that question, maybe let's back it up a little.
Yeah.
Let's review.
At least think about it more carefully and then come up with your own risk tolerance.
Right. Well, and oh gosh, it just seems like there's so many better ways to do all these things, because at the end of the day, the goal is, all of these things are marketing tactics, and the goal is to get more traffic or more views or higher reputation or whatever. And all of a sudden, when you are looking at these things that you think are shortcuts or sneaky or clever or whatever word you want to use, you're doing the opposite. All of a sudden, you're going to destroy all of that work to build your reputation, and you're going to look like either a cheat or a fraud or someone who, doesn't have the expertise that you have worked so hard to build. So, why would you put that at risk? It seems really silly.
Yeah, I mean, people are smart. They'll be able to understand if what you're doing is authentic or not.
Right.
And especially the types of people that you would like to have as clients, especially, will be able to suss that out.
Well, that's the other thing. You go down those slimy avenues. That's the kind of client you're going to get. And that doesn't sound fun.
Right.
That sounds like a nightmare. All right, so it is time for the book review. And I know you've got a good one to tie in to the whole conversation today about social media. So I did want to mention, too, that we have this cool library on the website for the podcast where all the guests have recommended books. And so you can go in there and check out and browse and look for the next best thing. And they're usually related to the topic that we're talking about. So there's a lot of good books. And so what is the book that you're going to recommend today?
The book I recommend is called Deceptive Patterns, Exposing the Tricks Tech Companies Use to Control You. It's written by this guy, Harry Brignull, and he coined the term dark patterns, which is now being used by the FTC and other regulators to describe marketing tactics that are intended or have the effect of misleading people.
Oh,
and so
I like that. It's called Dark Patterns?
It's called...
The book is called Deceptive Patterns, but the term is Dark Patterns?
The term is Dark Patterns.
That's cool.
He coined that in 2010. It's what the FTC uses to describe things like if the, confusing dialogue options, like no, I would not like to cancel, or where it should be like, yes or no,
Yes.
clearly, or like
Yes.
one box is smaller than the other, or it's
Yeah.
pre-checked. Things like that is just one example. And he's been an expert witness in a number of cases. He works with the FTC to help them build cases. He's really the guy that's been studying the marketing side in terms of the mechanics of how these things work, the psychology of it, and the state of global regulation of these sort of deceptive marketing tactics. And the book does a really good job of explaining it to the general audience, both, what was the genesis of these things?
Yeah.
How are they deployed? What are their effects, and how is the law trying to tackle it? I will disclose that he gave me a copy for free because we've been friends on Twitter, but certainly worth a read.
Well, so I've been doing this long enough that I remember in the days before the Can-Spam Act. So I don't know if everybody can kind of go back in their foggy, dusty memory before we had requirements around the unsubscribe button. But it's not just you have to have this unsubscribe button. It also has rules around how when you click, first of all, it should be a one-click thing, and it should be very clear. Like, this is how you unsubscribe, and you shouldn't have to do much more than a second click and you're done. But the reason that that is the way it is now is because it was such a mess before that. And it was like you had to go through like so many hoops. It would take forever. They claimed, these companies would claim, oh, this is going to take like a week or two. It's like, what are you talking about? This should be an automated thing. Like, you shouldn't have to have a human touch this. And so this is kind of a similar kind of thought process behind like these sort of deceptive ideas in making it really complicated. And then the psychology behind that, like, why would you want people to have this, once again, super negative experience with your company where they're just trying to get off your email list and
Right.
just make it easy, and they're going to assume that the rest of working with you is going to be the same way.
Yeah, I mean, the area that I address where this comes up most commonly has to do with subscriptions. And
Yeah.
there's a patchwork of state laws that have varying requirements. The FTC has their own requirements. They're updating those as well. And if you go on Trustpilot for any subscription-based company and you look at all the 1 stars, if there's something that's sticky about trying to cancel, that upsets customers like nothing else. That will certainly encourage people to go write a negative review more than anything else.
Yep.
And there's just an ongoing wave of class actions about it's either too hard to cancel, or you didn't disclose the terms, or you didn't send the right confirmation email, or whatever the state law violation is. So
Yeah. And there are laws already in place for all of these things. So, like, if you do have any kind of a subscription, and it could be just like an ongoing service that they are, being billed on a regular basis for. So it doesn't have to be like vitamins, like we've all seen all of those, very kind of questionable things. I remember clearly that there was an essential oil company that at one point somehow I got subscribed to. I won't use the name, but it took me months to get unsubscribed. And this was not that long ago. I want to say this was within the last couple of years. And I kept thinking, oh gosh, there are lawsuits waiting to happen here. So, it just shouldn't be that way. And you're going to get in serious trouble for making things more complicated than they need to be, aside from the damage to your reputation and your brand. So that's just such a bad idea.
yeah, I mean, again, just like consider your consumer. Would you want to have to place a phone call and be put on hold to cancel your cable? Probably not. So you shouldn't implement something similar in your own business.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so what's one big takeaway? We talked a lot about all these potential pitfalls, issues, places to make sure that you're covered in social media. What's a big takeaway that you'd like everyone to get from this episode?
I think just be mindful about the way that you're marketing, especially on social media, and how you're using content that you didn't create on your own, whether it's reviews or testimonials or a video that you're having created. Before you click post, think about the messages you're conveying, whether you've cleared all the rights to it, and that small amount of time before you click post where you just think through those issues can save you a hell of a lot of money down the road if something were to go wrong that you didn't think about.
Yeah, well, and also Are you trying to be clever? Like clever with the air quotes, which also translates to sneaky. Or are you trying to get around something? Like use that as part of that kind of thing you're describing, where that moment where you're reviewing. Like, let's not be clever. Just be, represent your brand, represent your service, represent your firm and whatever you're trying to say. But don't try to be sneaky and clever. Like that's kind of a slippery slope right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Rob Freund is an advertising attorney in LA and has all the tips. So follow him on all the social media. We will link to all of your social media on the show notes and the page and, for all the places where you're going to find this podcast. So thank you so much for being here. That was really helpful.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Counselcast podcast. Be sure to visit our website at counsel-cast.com for the resources mentioned on the episode and to give us your feedback. If you enjoyed this episode, I would appreciate if you could rate and review the podcast on Apple and subscribe to your favorite podcast platform. See you on the next one.